Dr. Roger D. Nelson is my guest today. Dr. Nelson is an American scientist and researcher who holds a PhD in cognitive psychology. For 22 years, he was the coordinator of research at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab at Princeton University, where his professional focus was the study of consciousness, intention, and how the mind affects the physical world. He's also the author of a book entitled Connected and the director of the Global Consciousness Project, which is an international multi-lab collaboration founded in 1997, studying collective consciousness. Dr. Nelson, it's great to have you as a guest today.
Thank you, Mark. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. I'm so excited about this. And I'd like to begin this conversation by letting the audience know just a bit about your background. You began your career in cognitive psychology. How does a cognitive psychologist get involved in anomalies research at Princeton University?
It may well be that the cognitive scientist starts out as a curious kid. At least that's true for me. When I was in high school, I wanted to learn judo or jujitsu or some one of those martial arts. Right. I went to the library, Carnegie Library in town. This is in Nebraska. That library, as far as I could tell, didn't have any books on judo or jujitsu. But in the process, I found a book on yoga. It was written by a German and an Indian, co-written. And it had such wisdom in it that was a kind of key to my loving the book, the content, and learning from it and becoming, I guess, getting an introduction is the best way I can say it, to the science of the mind and science of not just the perception and memory that I later studied at New York University and Columbia, but something like the extent of mind, which is not limited to the perception and the memory that's studied in usual psychology courses. So later I had opportunities to do a little bit of experimentation because my students were interested to do experiments in telepathy and ESP and psychokinesis, all those kinds of esoteric things. So I monitored them, but of course I was in the process of learning what they were learning.
Right.
And at some point a friend gave me an advertisement, a page in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which had a lot of jobs listed. He thought I might be interested in this or that. And adjacent to one of those things he thought I would be interested in was a curious advertisement that said Princeton University School of Engineering is looking for a cognitive scientist interested in the lesser known aspects of perception. So I immediately thought of things like the skin senses and smell. Nobody was studying those much, but it turned out to be the Pear Lab. It didn't even have a name yet. But so I went and I met Bob John and Brenda Dunn. And the rest, as they say, is history. Became the third member of the PAIR team, which was something required by the university administration. They were very leery about this project that the dean of the School of Engineering was setting up. So to satisfy some of their concerns, they needed some outsider. And so I was an outsider for a little while. So that put me at PAIR, and the PAIR group of researchers grew and changed over the years, but it was always people of, I guess, high intelligence and high curiosity and not much reticence about taking a chance in an intellectual field. So we had a really high performance team and put together experiments that have stood the test of time and replication. All of that. I'm going on and on, but this is how I got in.
Yeah, I love it. I'm thinking about in the current era. I don't know what the environment was like back when PAIR began, but in the current era, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of psi research going on. Not a lot of people even know that what psi research is, and that it's being done seriously. For the benefit of those who have no idea, what is psi research and why did Princeton take it seriously?
Well, I just generally, psi research refers to questions that are at the edge of what we know about consciousness, really. It's basically consciousness research, but in the realms that we don't know anything about. How far does the mind extend?
Right.
Nobody even asks in cognitive science graduate school about such a thing because they think of the mind as being something stuck in your head. It isn't. The mind is an extensive kind of thing. And in a sense, the psi research is an attempt to find what the extensions are and what kind of limitations there might be. What is the mind capable of beyond just seeing, hearing, feeling, that sort of, the standard five senses?
Right.
In fact, people often refer to it as extrasensory work. But even that is a kind of misnomer because it's really something like the mind at large, the title of a book written by my friend, I think, Charlie Tart and a couple of other of his friends out in California. Anyway, we're looking in psi research, we're looking to extend the understanding of what mind is, what consciousness is, and asking questions like, can the mind actually touch the world? Is there a possibility that mind is not, as I said, confined inside the skull, but instead extends out into the world with the capability of changing the world ever so slightly? And we basically are doing research in areas that people in some sense take for granted by when they're praying or wishing or betting on the horses. At least in fair gambling games, people expect to win because they want to.
Right.
I think, So that's the stuff of psi. There's more, but those are the things I think about most.
There is a lot more. So which leads us to the current conversation, the Global Consciousness Project. So I've spent a bit of time trying to wrap my head around this experiment, and I have a lot of questions for you. But before I do that, I'd like you to explain to the audience what the Global Consciousness Project is and how the experiment is designed.
In its fundamental design, and this is very personal, and some people will take it as scientific and some people not. The Global Consciousness Project is an effort to try to capture evidence, if there is any, for a global consciousness, for a mind that is comprised of all of us, somehow interacting in such a way as to, if not create a seeing, hearing entity, at least to create a noticeable entity. And I believe that we have succeeded in doing that. It may be helpful to tell the three-step process that resulted ultimately in the Global Consciousness Project. My work at first in the Paralab, along with the other people, was to see what would happen if you asked somebody to intend to change the behavior of a random number generator.
Right.
So we asked people to wish for high numbers or wish for low numbers when the device they were wishing about was designed to produce random numbers. We were asking people to wish for some structure to appear in a sequence of completely unpredictable random numbers.
Right.
And you can think of that as a sequence of coin flip, heads, tails, head, 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 tail, tail, head, tail. Only has zeros and ones, done electronically and very fast, and recorded by computers. So it's easy to keep track of what you're doing, what the instrument is doing itself, whether it's performing correctly. And then also keep track of what happens to the data if somebody intends to change it. And what we found is that people could succeed in doing that. And after something like 10 years, I was able to implement at last something that I had long wanted to, which was continuous recording of the data, not just one trial and another or 50 trials, but 24/7. This allowed us to begin to do things that we weren't able to do before. For example, we could have people attempt to affect the ongoing sequence of random data by intending to change it from 200 miles away. We would arrange to learn what their intentions were after the data were recorded, and then before anybody knew what the data were like. We were able to compare the intentions to what the data looked like. Anyway, we had continuous sequences, and that also allowed us, when the miniaturization of electronics occurred, we were able to make small random number generators, the proverbial matchbox size.
Right.
And that meant we could take these things out into the field, and we could go to a conference or maybe a concert with extremely dedicated fans, hundreds and thousands of people who were totally enchanted by whoever was presenting the conference, or to an opera, or to a cathedral, or out into the woods for a Sabbath ritual of a bunch of pagans. In other words, we could go to places where there were groups of people who became enchanted or engaged, deeply, powerfully moved by the situation in such a way that we believed that they would become a kind of group consciousness. And we're asking, that we called field REG, which was a double entendre. We're asking, is there such a thing as a field of consciousness in our field studies? And we found again that even though the people didn't necessarily have any idea that there was a random number generator in the audience,
right.
It nevertheless seemed to join in with everybody else and become part of the group consciousness and change its behavior ever so slightly, but significantly changed in statistical terms. So next question, how big might the group be?
Yeah.
And I was also a long-time fan of Teilhard de Chardin, who was a French theologian and, a Jesuit priest. But he was also a paleontologist, a scientist of high caliber. He was one of the discoverers of Peking man. Anyway, he said things like, we aren't pinnacle as we think we are of evolution, but instead there is another phase for us, another stage that we will progress toward and maybe even into. And that stage he called the noosphere. He said that we should become a sheath of intelligence for the earth. He didn't just say we should. He said, that's our destiny.
We would.
To become a kind of intelligent layer, like an atmosphere, only made of knowing for the earth. And that metaphor really powerfully affected me. So when I started the Global Consciousness Project, using the technology of the field research, I set up a network of many, many devices, ultimately something like 75, all around the world. And the data from continuously running random number generators were sent back to Princeton. And we could identify moments in the history of the world that looked rather like the people had come together to be this noosphere, whether they knew it, being a completely different kind of question. So we identified events that seemed most likely to cause a kind of coherent gathering of mind and emotion, especially emotion, in really large numbers, maybe millions of people. And sometimes those events in the world would be tragic, like a plane crash that killed all of its people, and or a hurricane that destroyed whole cities. Right. Those kinds of things. But we also looked at celebrations, things like religious gatherings and things like New Year's, and a kind of abstract event in the extreme. What is New Year's? It's a moment in time, right? That's right. But large numbers of people come together to celebrate, lift a glass, hug somebody exactly at midnight. So there's a kind of focus on a moment in time. And what we found was a kind of focusing of the data close to that moment in time, and then a return to normal random behavior afterwards.
So you have 70 of these, or 75, you said?
Well, yes. The numbers changed over time. They grew for many years until they sort of peaked at 70 or thereabouts. And then since I finished the formal experiment in actually several years ago, in December of 2015, I continued to run the network, but without the persistent help for the nodes to stay alive. Right. In other words, I stopped working so hard on it. Right. And it has diminished in size since then because, people have other things to do in their lives.
But there's a startling amount of data that you did collect during that period in time. And if I can just recap, basically, the premise of the experiment is that our unconscious connections are fostered by a resonant and coherent emotion felt by large numbers of people responding to events. And this can be seen on random generators that you set up across the world. For those who don't know how a random generator works or what it is, how does it work? What is a random number generator?
Well, it's an electronic coin flipper, a high-speed electronic coin flipper. But how it works, the ones that we use, there are several kind of sources you could use for truly random variation, including radioactivity, optical kinds of things. But what we use is electronic devices like diodes and field effect transistors. They're basically switches. They're very important in all kinds of electronic circuits. But just for example, the simplest ones are diodes. And we set up a circuit so that we have a diode switch turned off, and we push current against that switch. It's a barrier, which is somehow, and this is a quantum phenomenon, through something that's called quantum electron tunneling, some of the blocked electrons penetrate, or at least they appear on the other side. It's a mysterious quantum process.
Right.
And that penetration or surmounting of the barrier is a completely unpredictable thing. And therefore, the tiny voltage that develops on the other side is also completely unpredictable. And that's another way of saying random. We have no idea, not even the system knows what the next voltage level will be, high or low, 1 or 0. And so we are able to make truly random numbers that have a future that's completely unknown. And in a sense, I think, therefore, the word I like to use is labile, but most people know that, that word. It's the future is unfixed. So it can change from what it might have been. It sounds like crazy words, but that's what we are looking at, a random sequence whose future is completely indeterminate. And we're asking, in the experiments in the laboratory, we're asking people to determine it just a little bit. Try to get a 1 instead of a 0, when it should have been a 0.
So
anyway,
unlike bending spoons, for instance, the implication of this experiment is that there's a result that seems to indicate that when the world population is focused on an event, something that is ordinarily disordered, chaotic, becomes ordered somehow. Do I have that correct?
Absolutely correct. We are looking at a phenomenon where structure is added to a completely random system. It's structure that should not be there if it's truly random. And that's detected through statistics, but that is the essence of it. We are structuring the chaos. Some people say we're reducing the entropy. And another way of describing true random sequences is that they are fully entropic, meaning they have complete entropy. That's just another way of saying there's no information there. And so we add a little tiny bit of information and we can detect that. It changes from random to slightly not random.
And that is mind-blowing. So
it is mind-blowing.
For the clinically minded listener, in case there are scientists out there listening, I want to get down to the brass tacks of your data collection process and your analysis method. In a paper that you wrote entitled Evoked Potential for Global Consciousness Project Data, you wrote, such signal averaging reduces or washes out random fluctuations while structured variations linked to the stimulus builds up over multiple samples. The resulting pattern usually shows a large excursion preceded and followed by smaller deviations with a typical time course relative to the stimulus. Can you explain what that means for the average listener?
Yeah, most people don't know about it, but the example, the starting point is to think about what the brain does if you flash a light or make a loud sound. The brain reacts.
Yes, it does.
And it can be seen in EEG traces, from which we take the data that become evoked potential measures. So if I flash a light and capture the brain activity in the occipital cortex, it would be just a mess. But if I do it again and again, if I do it 100 times, that mess will begin to become a very nicely formed shape. Mm-hmm. And the shape is, we know from repeating this using various different senses and various different kinds of analysis, that shape becomes a description, really, of the average brain reaction mm-hmm. to this flash of light. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the brain is an extremely, complex organism, and what it's doing a zillion things, and therefore, in the context of the question about the evoked potential when you flash the light, mm-hmm. it's going to be a matter of very small signal or one little signal in the midst of a huge array of activity in the brain. And the same thing is true for the global consciousness data. Mm-hmm. We have an extremely small signal to noise ratio. Right. That is to say, there's a small signal and a huge amount of noise. Mm-hmm. And we only can detect such a signal by patiently repeating the question again and again. Mm-hmm. In the case of the flashing of the light in the person's brain, I think it's easy to see if you realize that the normal activity of a brain is just a whole lot of variation. Right. If you want to see the signal of a little flash of light in a little part of the brain, you have to do epoch averaging, mm-hmm. where the epoch is each flash of light, each measurement from the brain. Average a whole bunch of those, and then you'll finally get a picture of what does the brain do when a light is flashed. And the same thing is true, I think. I was able to demonstrate that using the data from the Global Consciousness Project in a little different way from our usual presentation. I basically did the same kind of thing, signal averaging over a whole lot of data. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, and to me, it's, after the fact, it's not a big surprise. But at first you say, oh my goodness, this looks ever so much like an evoked potential. Mm-hmm. But what are we looking at in the global consciousness events? We're looking at a stimulus, right, to arouse powerful and shared, maybe even coherent emotions in a large number of people. And we're asking, what do the data look like in that circumstance? And we do that again and again. The GCP has 500 formally specified events that we can average and look at in various different ways. And they're not all hits. They are all the same small signal in a sea of noise. Sometimes I say we're looking for a goldfish in the ocean. Right. It's not easy.
No, it's not. But your averaging is the best approach at this point. And it's my understanding that these anomalies that you're seeing are structures occurring that are on the level of the chance of 1 in a trillion. Is that correct?
When we put all the data together for 17 years and 500 well-characterized formal experiments, mm-hmm. that's the bottom line. About 2/3 of the events show the effect we predict. So we're not always right, or at least the data don't always go in the direction we predict. Mm-hmm. But 3/4 of them do, and that's not likely. If you got 500 things, that's like, what do you think is going to be the average if you're flipping a coin 500 times? Right. Yeah, you won't get usually anything like 2/3 of them. Mm-hmm. So there's something going on, and the overall effect size is in terms of standard deviations, which is a measure of how far out you are in the bell curve of data. Mm-hmm. We are only 1/3 of a standard deviation out on average. Mm-hmm. But when you combine 1/3 of a standard deviation with 500 repetitions that you're in your database, you come up with 7 standard deviations, right, or what the physicists like to call 7 sigma, mm-hmm. as the bottom line for how much deviation there is in, how strong is the evidence, is another way to put it, right, in this experiment. And that's trillion to 1, I think, on the order of 3 trillion to 1 odds.
And all of these seem to be taking place at what you're calling the initiating moments of the occurrence. They say, and it's also followed by a few hours of activity due to a global response to an event that's happening in the world.
Yeah, the timing is it's somewhat like that. Is a little complicated because many events don't have an initiating moment.
Right.
There are things like peace marches. What's the initiating moment?
Right, exactly.
And those kinds of things, we have a standard operating procedure for such an ill-defined moment, and it is to look at the whole day, because these are moments, the peace marches or the Earth Day kinds of things.
Right.
These are things that the whole world is interested in, we believe. So we look at the whole world in 24-hour UTC or Greenwich Mean Time day,
Right.
and just as a standard measure. And also early on, I learned that the data seemed to begin changing sometimes a little early. So most of the events that do have a sharp point, like an earthquake, there's a moment when the main trembler occurs. And you can get that from government data precisely.
Right.
But what I usually do is take that moment in time and fix the beginning of the so-called event at the hour marker just prior to it. So that sometimes has half an hour, 45 minutes or whatever, some period of time prior to the so-called stimulus point.
Right.
And also then time for the world to know about it, or for the global consciousness to wake up and pay attention.
Kind of catch up, right?
Yeah. So the most frequent event length is 6 hours, but usually starts 15, 20, 30 minutes before the point that seems like we could call it the beginning of the event.
Almost precognitive.
Yes, and there is some evidence in the data that there is, we use the term precursor. There's precursor activity. But it's you can think of it in psi terms as being something like precognition.
Right.
We don't know whether there might be such a thing as, well, we don't really know that there's a global consciousness.
Right.
But if there is, maybe it's a little like human consciousness. That's the kind of assumption I work on, and in most of the work, the evoked potential stuff. The parallel is immensely clear if you just look at example after example after example of what the events look like processed as if they were evoked potential events. They look ever so much like run-of-the-mill evoked potential brain events. And in a kind of similar way, I really expect the whole panoply of human activities, or mental or emotional activities, to be at least potentially represented in what we see in the data. And I've done quite a bit of research, which I call categorization research, where I take all of the events, go through the events and rate them as to how much fear there is, or how much compassion there is, or how many people may be involved in participating in the event, or recognizing it, whatever, and other things whether it's a positive event or a negative event, what kind of effects do these different categories show? Right. And so that research really leads to the conclusion. I gave a BL presentation a few years ago in Portugal, the BL Foundation, on essentially the emotional presence in the global consciousness data, using this kind of categorization research. And at the time, I was also looking at the standard emotions. William James and other early psychologists realized that we should try to understand these various emotional states because they were part of human consciousness. Yeah. And it turns out that I think without much question, the global consciousness data representing a putative and maybe existent, maybe non-existent global consciousness have the same kind of structure with regard to emotions and other things like the number of people, distance from the event, all kinds of things like that. It really looks like a very large-scale consciousness, a parallel to the kind of thing that we know about ordinary human consciousness.
It certainly does. I mean, to me, this entire experiment and all psi experiments in general have profound implications. But what I'm really blown away by with reading the papers that you've written on what you've seen, this phenomenon seems to have a somewhat different flavor from what I was familiar with regarding psi experiments, where you're talking about rather than teaching somebody to try to focus and direct personal consciousness towards a particular effect, like bending spoons or something like that, this phenomenon seems to be occurring without any particular intent with regards to the occurrences. So it's not like you're attempting to have the masses focus on the RNGs. The RNGs are simply reflecting a coherence that is occurring due to a mass focus of human consciousness on some world event. That has a different flavor, a different feeling to me than psi experiments. Am I reading this correctly?
You are, and it reminds me of the understanding that I had when I started the project. I didn't want to try to organize the world
Right.
or people around the world to change my machines.
Right.
Instead, what I wanted to do was to create a kind of monitoring system that would find out what the people were doing in some sense, or at least find out what the random number generators were doing in response to things like the induced emotional states. For 9/11, for example, I think it's without question, there was a tremendous amount of fear immediately, tremendous amount of anger shortly after, and probably very soon a very large and growing amount of compassion sort of produced in that situation. You can look at the data and see those kinds of things, but I basically was impressed with the notion that we should stay out of it. We should not try to organize an experiment where we're trying to get people, or we're not trying to test people.
Right.
We really wanted to find out what the natural occurrence is with regard to something like consciousness effect on random systems. Well, it's a large natural experiment. Things happen. And some of those things we believe will bring people together in just powerful coherence, resonance, and shared emotions. And we thought that it would be just the right thing to try to monitor what this array of randomness might look like during such moments. And there is another category, probably on the order of half the events are of this nature. They're not stimulated by some outside event. It's not an incoming, stimulus. Instead, it's one that we create. If we decide to have an organized meditation starting at 3:00 Eastern time, and that means noon on the West Coast and something like, 7 in the evening, or 8 in Europe, we want to get people to all meditate synchronously.
Right.
And I conceive those events also to be the sort of thing that would make, it would make sense to monitor.
Well, that's why I'm trying to create a line of demarcation here between those who are analyzing what you're presenting from a clinical standpoint, pure science, and the potential and the ramifications of this potential if we were to harness consciousness. So I want to get into the realm of conjecture, slightly outside of science, although it may be part of a science that I don't fully grasp, which is quantum theory. We can conjecture about mechanisms behind such occurrences, why the mind has any influence over matter, why the mind can create order out of chaos or randomness. And the first place my mind wants to go, at least on one level of theoretical physics, we'll call it, is that human consciousness is interacting with what Bentoff and Baum called a hologram. Now, I don't know what your thoughts are about the mechanisms behind this phenomenon, but do you think the holographic model might play a part? Is that a decent model from your perspective?
I think it's an inspirational model, which doesn't mean I think that it's necessarily the right one, but it's a very thoughtful and thought-provoking model.
Mm-hmm.
My preference is, I think you mentioned Bohm, but
Yes.
Bohm also talked about the implicate order
Yes.
and the infinite, literally infinite unknown potential of in the implicate order. And he also talked about manifestation of reality out of
Right.
the potential that was residing in the implicate order, and talked about active information as, or he called it also a pilot wave, which directs the emergence into reality of something that only had potential in the implicate order. And so my favorite model is, it goes from there, from that kind of, implicate information. It's not obvious, immediately obvious, and I'm not at all sure that Bohm would agree with my interpretation of that, concept. But it seems to me that it's possible that we, human beings, our minds in particular, are sources of information and structure. We talked about it already. So the mind, I think, doesn't exist only inside my head. In fact, it is really an entity that lives in the world. It has full roles and functions in the real world. And so with regard to random number generators, I know about it. My mind reaches out and touches it because my mind is out in the world.
Right.
The simple-minded device really doesn't care where the information comes from.
It too is part of that
because
system.
Yeah,
Right.
This random sequence I was talking about earlier, which has no defined future, it has no problem accepting a little bit of information to help define the future. And so it does.
It just does.
There is an information field that's present. Bohm called it active information. And I think that we are sources of active information. That is the information field, or consciousness field, as some people like to say, that is sourced in us, in our mind. That is basically unlimited in scope. It has a kind of non-locality, both in space and time. So we have premonitions, we have recognitions of, or retrocognitions, and we have remarkably clear, scientifically demonstrated effects on the real world, on physical devices in the world. It's hard to convince mainstream science that the data are good, but they are really good. There are so many gatherings of meta-analysis data that show that, yes, there is an effect of my intention in the world. So back to your question about models, I'm not really a theorist, but of course I think about it.
Right.
Couldn't do this kind of thing for 20 years without wondering how it happens.
Right.
I rather think that our individual consciousness extends out and interpenetrates with other consciousnesses. Yours, even though you're far away, and mine are interacting now and creating something that is a manifestation of their interaction. The two of us create something that wasn't there before. And where does that exist? It exists in a kind of non-local space and time. So Bohm's notion of, where it all comes from strikes me as a pretty fertile way of thinking about these kinds of phenomena. A more down-to-earth metaphor or example. I, a long time ago, wrote a little paper called Physics of Healing, something like that.
Right.
And I very specifically outlined a way that mental healing or non-local or distant healing could happen if I had a healer in New York and a patient or a Healy in San Francisco, we know from the research that the healer can change the way things are so that the Healy in California becomes better.
Yes, I've seen plenty of studies to confirm that, and I've
Right.
actually studied various spiritual healing disciplines, and seen results, all
Yes.
subjective data, of course, but seen the results within my own practice. I'm fascinated by this, and I think we need to clear up a few terms here for folks. So we tread on the territory of implicate and explicate order. We tread on the territory of spooky action at a distance. We talk about these phenomenon as being a byproduct of consciousness. So one of the easiest and most cogent definitions that I've ever heard regarding consciousness is that consciousness is a compendium of cortical stimulation through sensory input, i.e. the information we gather through our senses, and cognitive content, meaning the information we stored in our memory and how we've made sense of things in the world, bringing order to chaos. That definition speaks to what I can only call personal consciousness. You're talking about consciousness in a more global type of way, in what the mystics used to call, or Joseph Campbell called, the sea in which we swim. So how do you personally define consciousness?
Well, sometimes, it's terribly flippant, but I like the idea of saying that consciousness is what allows us to ask a question like that. But that's not a satisfying definition. I think consciousness is, I just don't even try to define it in some sort of mathematical way, because it doesn't seem amenable to that.
Right.
So I think about consciousness as being this sort of wonderful combination of potential and awareness and the ability to self-reflect. I mean, nobody else on the Earth or any other planet, as far as we know, is asking a question like this,
Right.
because they can't. My dog, I'm sure, is conscious, but he doesn't formulate things in a language that allows him to deal with or present to himself a difficult kind of question.
Right.
About
let alone the meaning.
Who am I?
Right, exactly. The meaning of his existence. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So, but I heard in your personal reflection something that is very, very attractive. It's the brain. It does this kind of processing and neurals, and we can measure stuff and all of that. And I personally have a little a kind of reaction to that, which is something on the order of, yes, but there's a whole lot going on that isn't in it can't be captured by those electrodes. Now, I'm a kind of proponent of the notion that it's some of this and some of that. We don't have consciousness of the sort we can use or study or anything like that if we don't have a brain that's active and alive. On the other hand, we have plenty of evidence that just knowing about what the meat is doing and how it's pulsing and vibrating isn't sufficient.
No.
Because there are things that, the classic and simple kinds of examples are personal experience of things like colors. What is red in brain terms?
Right.
What is the experience of love?
Right. Where does it live in the brain? Right.
Yeah. What is the brain doing? Well, it's reacting and responding, but is that reaction and response a sufficient definition of something like the emotion of compassion?
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. And I think what attracts me to that language is that, at least in my thinking, it's expansive enough to allow for the idea of consciousness unfolding. For instance, when you have no experience in, say, any psi phenomenon, That's not been part of your life experience. And then all of a sudden you have the experience and you know at a very deep level that you cause some spooky action at a distance. It gets recorded in that cognitive content. Now you start to think on some level, perhaps consciously, perhaps unconsciously, that you are interacting with this field, this hologram, this greater consciousness system, if we can call it that, in a new way. And in doing so, there's a new unfolding of your relationship to all of life and consciousness in general. Consciousness enlarges, consciousness expands, it unfolds. So those words have this clinical, scientific, mechanistic sound to them. But because I'm an artist, perhaps, I see the beauty and the potential in that language in a way that includes what it was that you were talking about prior, the interaction.
I don't any longer know exactly what it was, but before I went to graduate school, I was thinking about consciousness and and the mind and so forth. And you used a few words like confluence and construction and whatever, and it was so much like what I was thinking at that time. And basically, I was imagining that you could define consciousness with the three C's. The confluence of context into collaborative consciousness or something. It really is a beautiful metaphor, I think, this kind of, literally I'm referring to that, the meat mass, the energetic activity inside your brain and all of that stuff. It's a wonderful metaphor. But I think we have to recognize that rather than being the answer to the question is a form of the question. This activity of brain is clearly important and correlated with, and is part of what we call consciousness. But it's a big part of the story. It's not. It isn't the full story yet. It's like chapters 2, 3, and 4. But maybe there's the introduction and the conclusion are still to be written.
Right. I'm of the mind we're at the preface in the story of consciousness. We've got a lot of growing to do, and I want to talk about that some more. But I want to reaffirm what it is that we've been talking about so far to the listener, because so much of this gets out of the realm of science and into mysticism, because apparently the mystics had some sense of this aeons ago, long before science was what it is today, we'll call it peer-reviewed, clinical, that sort of thing. So with what we're reading here in the Global Consciousness Project, my mind wants to try to understand two things specifically, I think. First, how my consciousness is creating reality, which is popular, new agey, mystical buzzwords, which makes scientists run the other way. And the other question that seems to emerge for me is when my consciousness is directed from an outside stimulus, with regards to the Global Consciousness Project now, like something like a news source, okay? As opposed to, something that I'm having a personal experience of in my daily life, where I might be focusing my personal goals through intention. I get the impression that I'm participating in creating a reality that's not necessarily in accordance with my personal concerns or goals when I think about the data that's being presented with the Global Consciousness Project. An event happens. The entire world focuses on it. My consciousness is participating in that. How am I creating reality in that moment? You understand where I'm going with this line of thinking?
I think so. A response, I will bring up another word that is sort of current, and it's co-creation.
Yes.
We aren't alone, and we are all connected, and we have always been. Every culture, every sage, and any tradition says the same thing. We are all one.
Yeah.
So that is, I'm pretty personally certain, is always and forever true. Even though we do the best we can to separate ourselves as individuals, we just cannot actually remove ourselves from the connections that exist, whether we like it or not, with everybody else on the planet, every other living being, and even the non-sentient beings. We're part of a big matrix of life. Now, I don't know enough to belong to the circles who discuss those kinds of things. I'm not a philosopher and I'm not a theoretician. Mm-hmm. I only know what the data say, and the data say we are connected, and that we have agency. We are participants in the development of the future.
As Edgar Mitchell pointed out during the keynote speech he gave at the Monroe Institute during a professional division seminar, that he was telling the story about and his beliefs about the universe is actually a biofeedback learning loop of sorts, right, which seems to be coming to understand itself through our consciousness. Another thing that he pointed out with regards to how simple it is to see this unity in action is to just go 250,000 miles and look back. All of a sudden you could see quite easily how connected everything is, at least on the Earth. I totally get what you're saying, and I think that on a global scale, we are starting to understand more of our interconnectedness. Yeah. Unfortunately, we seem to be grasping at learning that through our tech and media sources.
Well, why do you say unfortunate?
Because of what I said before about having consciousness directed in a certain arena and the ramifications of that directed consciousness.
Yeah. Well, I have to say I agree with you, but I'm aware that time marches on, that the picture that I have is not going to develop completely while I'm on this earth, and that it will, on the other hand, absolutely develop somewhere along the way. Mm-hmm. I think of the tech sometimes. I'm kind of a Luddite. I don't use it. I have one, but I don't use my smartphone. People are disappointed that they're not able to call me any time of the day, anywhere I might be.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. So, but I hugely respect the fact that the young people are connecting with each other, even though it's not the way I wish they would. Mm-hmm. I would love for everybody to connect by hugging each other. But on the other hand, it's very hard to get your arms around somebody who's in Japan if you happen to be in Princeton. Even though you might love to give that hug, what you have to do is figure out how to do it technically, I guess. Mm-hmm. Or at least that's, I think, maybe a path that we're on without really knowing it yet.
Yes, I agree with you. And I'm not really placing too much of a value judgment on tech and what it does to human relationships. That'll probably have its ups and downs. I am considering what we've been discussing here, and I can't help but think of the implications of how consciousness can be worked to an effect. We can see clearly that consciousness is having an effect on reality and that we're creating order out of chaos through our focus and emotion. So what I'm wondering is, what will we be creating, and how will our collective consciousness, when focused by an outside source, such as a news agency, who may or may not have a specific agenda, how that affects our consciousness both collectively and personally, which therefore creates reality through that agency you mentioned without the viewer actually being aware of it. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's about 85 different things as you're talking. But I want to start by saying I personally believe, and this is through my direct experience of people communicating with me, that there is more of what I think of as the positive development stuff happening all the time. That is, when I was in graduate school and protesting the Vietnam War, I said to myself, it's clear that more people now have their heads on straight. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that it didn't seem truly to be manifesting in the society we proceeded through in the next few years.
But there was promise.
there was promise. And now I'm thinking that I'm seeing I think I am seeing a gathering of forces. They're not gathered yet. They're not organized. And on the other hand, because of this like unconscious connection that we all share, to me, it seems almost certain that this gathering will proceed. It will gather momentum. And on the other hand, we have huge, powerful forces that are on the other side of the fence.
Yes.
And one of the major questions I ask myself every now and then is how we can speak to, how we can communicate with people on the other side of the fence. It's definitely not anything I have any kind of an answer for, except that encouragement of the people who are on the good guys side of the fence, in my opinion, the people who believe that love and compassion are important. That should be fostered every chance we get. And as you say, there's a pretty powerful indication in the global consciousness data that that it works, that there is a kind of gathering of forces, and we don't see bigger effects as we go along. We see this very persistent effect. Every time we look at one of these events, there's a chance that it will turn out to say, yes, keep on trucking. You have the right general notion. You just have to work at it.
Well,
keep on going. So I'm an eternal optimist.
Well, again, the implications of this data, the experiment at large, is inspiring. And something you wrote on a paper dated May 9th, 2020 is also inspiring. You write, "We can manifest the future of our choice if we become more aware of the power that rests in our unconscious connections. We need to help ourselves, and I think we can do that. When we bring our unconscious interconnections up into awareness, we will be able to change the world. Cooperation and collaboration are a birthright that is more powerful than we know, and the evidence suggests that it is ready to claim now." It's a very beautiful and moving statement, and one that echoes a lot of the sages through time. But here we are in the current era, and you as a scientist are echoing not only that wisdom, you're also proving that we're creating our world, and we have some serious choices to make.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think it's true. Maybe we should talk sometime about GCP 2.0, where there is an effort underway, and it's well underway now, to build a new and bigger and better GCP. I'm working with people in the West Coast community of inspired scientists, if you will, HeartMath Institute and the Global Coherence Initiative and IONS, and a number of other people coming together. Because the signs are there, the suggestions are, I think, pretty clear. And the more information we have about it, the more science we can bring to it, the more likely we will be able to bring other people into the fold, more scientists and more citizens. Part of what we want to do is create a kind of citizen science aspect to this thing, which means bring people in who are interested enough to put in some time and energy. And on the other hand, I haven't gone through the background that you and I have working with the pioneers in these fields. Anyway, let's plan to talk about that sometime.
We can. Well, for those who would like to know more or contribute to such a project, how would they get in touch with you?
My website is global-mind.org. And there is you can find all kinds of background information, all kinds of ways to do your own analysis, access the data, and old papers and videos and whatnot. And so that's a good possibility. And there, if people want to write to me, I do email. Yeah, it's rdnelson, rdnelson at Princeton, princeton.edu. I'd be happy to talk with people. And this new project, the Global Consciousness 2.0, GCP 2.0, will have its own website that'll be coming up soon. If you go to glcoherence.org, You can find the Global Coherence Initiative website, or just put in Global Coherence Initiative in your search engine. That will bring you there. And there will be a link, probably fairly close to the top of the page, about GCP 2.0. And it really is designed to invite people to participate in it as citizen scientists, which means investing in the beautiful new random device, which is a lot of different random number generators all in one unit. Mm-hmm. And there will be 1,000 of them all together spread around the world. So we'll have a much larger network. And we'll be looking at things like geomagnetic fields and cosmic influx, solar influx, and things like social media measures and so on, all put into a huge database and allowing us to ask ever more pertinent questions about how is global consciousness developing? How can I help its development? How can we midwife this thing into a real presence, an effective presence in the world? I think that's just around the corner.
I couldn't agree more, and I want to inspire that by wrapping this first conversation. I hope we can have you back often to update us with a couple of things that I kind of acknowledge as I'm listening to you talk. One, that we're creating reality together, at least in some mysterious form and in part. That our personal consciousness also needs to be explored and understood. And in addition to the idea that all things are connected, that we're being tasked at this point in our history to maybe use consciousness more wisely, and that we're really in this together as
yes,
as co-creators.
Co-creators,
right?
All the way down.
All the way down. And these are among the types of things that the Monroe Institute, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, HeartMath, yourself, Michio Kaku, Carl Sagan, Charles Tart, Edgar Mitchell. I mean, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'm presenting this for future generations for their consideration. So as a last word of inspiration, what would you recommend to anyone who is finding themselves inspired through listening to this information? How can they observe their conscious intentions? Use consciousness in a more fruitful way that will lead us towards a better future. If you were to impart your wisdom to a younger generation, what would you say? What paths would you lead them on?
The short form is one word: meditation.
Meditation.
Now, there are lots and lots of forms of meditation, but if you do want to get to know yourself, learn to meditate. Mm-hmm. Learn from other people, from teachers, from books, from institutes like Monroe. I think that's one of the premier places to take some lessons from. Anyway, every day, give yourself the gift of 20 minutes of quiet self-reflection, or ultimately no reflection. Mm-hmm. 20 minutes of peace in meditation.
That's it. Easily done, right? Dr. Nelson, right. It's scientists like yourself which not only keep the mystery alive for me, but also inspire something greater. You, Carl Sagan, I put you in the same category as all those. It's a marvelous study that you've done, and it inspires me on a level that Carl Sagan really did when he first said, I was made of the stuff of stars. I mean, He had me at that. What do you mean? That sounds so lofty, but it's so true.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mark, for a wonderful conversation. I love your questions because they make me think, and they make me think about things that are, I think, of ultimate importance. Who are we, and how can we be better, and how can we become what we are destined to be? Those are the kinds of questions that we should all be asking and seeking answers to. Anyway, thank you so much, and I'd love to be back again sometime.
Great. Thank you for your kind words regarding my questions. I'm very curious, and I love to be engaged. This is my favorite conversation, and having conversations with people of your ilk and presenting it to others who can listen and eventually become part of this conversation. Expect a lot of questions coming up from others who will be listening?
I have such a clever thing to say. We can all be of an ilk together.
Yes, I love it. Well, from my ilk to your ilk, have a wonderful, fantastic day. Thank you so much, really. I couldn't be more appreciative of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2022, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.